If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying these stories, there's a link below to buy me a cup of coffee. This is the Chassidic Story Project with Barak Hullman, podcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. This podcast is sponsored by listeners just like you. To become a supporter of this podcast, please go to HasidicStory.com. HASIDIC story.com. You'll never know. You'll never know. You'll never know. You'll never know. Shalom Aleichem, my sweetest friends. It's time for some more Chassidic stories, B'ezrat Hashem. And this week I have 3 stories for you. But before I begin, I want to dedicate this podcast episode to the continued success of our soldiers in battle wherever they are, B'ezrat Hashem. The returning of all the hostages, whole, healthy, alive, B'ezrat Hashem. The refuah shlema, the full recovery of everybody who's been injured or who is ill. The comforting of those that lost loved ones. And the continued unity of the Jewish people here in the land of Israel and all around the world. Everybody knows that in the late 1700s and early 1800s, it was one of the most pivotal times in Jewish history. We had, of course, the 2 giant earthquakes that happened in Jewish communities. The first was emancipation, and the second, enlightenment. And I've mentioned this before. Emancipation was allowing the Jews to be regular citizens like everyone else and to integrate into the secular society. And the Enlightenment was the idea of atheism, which of course we see in our day and time. Both of these concepts have dominated Jewish life. So in those days, in the time of Napoleon, there were 2 Jews, Moshe and Yankel, and they were living in Minsk, which was then part of the Russian Empire. And Minsk had a thriving Jewish community that had existed since the 16th century. It was known for its great yeshivot and Torah scholars. But Minsk was also feeling the winds of change and modernization that were coming and beginning to influence their young Jewish men. Moshe and Yankel had been friends since they were kids. They went to cheder together, they went to yeshiva together, and when they saw a new opportunity to go into business, they went into business together, and they became multimillionaires. Now this is during the time when Jews were just beginning to enter international commerce on a larger scale, and the restrictions on Jewish businesses were gradually being lifted all around Europe. And one day the 2 of them looked at one another, and they reminisced. Just 5 years ago they'd been sitting in yeshiva learning Talmud all day, and they'd never even left the Jewish quarter of Minsk, and now they were multi-millionaires and international entrepreneurs. They were so busy making money that neither of them were even interested in getting married. And when it came to religion, well, the more money they made, the less Jewish they became. Of course, they didn't go by the names Moshe and Yankel anymore. Moshe decided to go by Morris, and Yankel simply went by Jacob. And they didn't dress as Jews anymore. They wore the fanciest custom-made suits, top hats, gloves, and they were part of the high-end society in Berlin, in Paris, in Vienna. And they had seen the real world. Their eyes had been opened, and they couldn't believe how far they've gone from the old days when they were sitting, learning Torah all day. And they never stayed in one place for very long. They were always traveling, making deals. They had a driver and a carriage, and now they were traveling to Minsk for an important business deal. Things were going well, the weather was good, the roads were good, but as you know, in those days, you couldn't travel at night. There were no lights on the streets, and of course, the lamp lights that were on the carriages were not enough to light up what would be in front of them. It was dangerous to travel at night. So there were small inns all along the way, next to the road, where people would spend the night. And so they stopped at one of those inns to have a meal and to sleep for the night. And the small dining room was empty when they entered. There was a very kind innkeeper, a well-built, large, old man who greeted them with a nice smile. He shows them to a table and asks them what they'd like to eat. And they ask for a menu. And then he looks at them for a few seconds and he says, "Excuse me, gentlemen, from your accents, I have a sense that you're Jewish." They smiled, looked at one another, and then raised an eyebrow and said, "The fact is we are Jewish, but not so Jewish. What difference does it make anyway?" The innkeeper said, "Well, if you want, I can bring you kosher food." "Right, isn't that what you call it, kosher?" "Not far from here is a kosher inn. I can go over there and get you some kosher food. It'll take me maybe half an hour to get there and back. Do you want to wait?" Now Moshe and Yankel had eaten every type of treif there was. They drank non-kosher wine, they didn't keep Shabbos, and they certainly weren't going to wait half an hour for kosher food. So they laughed and they said, "Please, don't do anything special for us. Just bring us some good meat and wine, and don't worry about the price. Bring us the best you have." He said, "Okay, gentlemen, I'll just be a few minutes. I have to prepare the meat and prepare your wine." And he left the room, and the two businessmen sat back in their chairs, smoking cigars, blowing rings in the air, and talking about the business deal that they were heading towards. And suddenly, the door of the kitchen burst open, and the innkeeper comes out like a wild animal. His face is red with anger, and he has murder in his eyes. He had rolled up his sleeves, showing muscular arms, and in his hand that was raised up, he had a huge, razor-sharp hatchet. He said to Yankel and Moshe, "You two are dead men! I'm going to kill you! I'm a robber and a murderer, and I've just been waiting for two fat Jews like you two to walk into my inn when nobody's here. Put your hands on the table and don't move." Of course, they put their hands on the table. He said to them, "One move, and I'll start chopping." And he raised the hatchet, as though in any second he would use it. And Yankel and Moshe started screaming, "Please, no, please! Take our money! We won't tell anyone. We have so much money. You'll be rich for your whole life. You'll never need to work again. Please have mercy on us. Oh, God, please have mercy on us." So the innkeeper said, "You two Jews like to pray, huh? I didn't think you were the praying type. Well, you know what? If you want to pray, I'll give you a few more minutes before I finish you off. Get up, put your hands on your head." And by this time, the innkeeper's son had entered the room. He checked Moshe and Yankele to see if they had a weapon, and then pushed them into a small bedroom and locked the door. He told them, "You have 5 minutes to pray. The window is boarded up, and there's nothing in the closet, so don't think you have any way of saving yourselves. 5 minutes? No, you have 3 minutes to pray." And as soon as the bedroom door closed, the two businessmen fell on the ground and were begging Hashem for forgiveness. What was their money worth now? Or all the plays and operas they'd attended? Or all of the connections they had in high places? Every moment that they wasted burned in their hearts. All they really wanted to do at this point was do tshuva before they were killed. And they tried to remember the prayers from the Siddur, from the prayer book, just anything. They were crying and begging Hashem, promising they would do anything if Hashem would just save their lives. And then 10 minutes later, the door opens very gently, and the innkeeper is standing there with a kind smile on his face. He didn't have a hatchet in his hand this time, and he even bent down to help the two businessmen to their feet, and they were so confused they couldn't even speak. The innkeeper says, "I have to apologize to you. I'm not a murderer, even a thief. I was never going to kill you. I'm sorry that I scared you, but I didn't have a choice." And they couldn't believe their eyes. They were wondering, is this real or is this a hallucination? And the innkeeper says, "Come, let's sit back at the table and I'll explain." The innkeeper poured them some whiskey, and he said about 20 years ago in the middle of winter, it was near the end of the terrible war with Napoleon, and here in my inn, a whole group of Jews showed up. It was snowing outside and freezing. Now these were real Jews, not like you two. Real religious Jews, with beards and strings and big hats on their heads. They told me that their rabbi was in one of the sleighs, and that he was sick, and they needed a place to sleep. Now I didn't have any love for Jews, and I didn't want to give them a place to sleep in my inn, but I went out to take a look at their sick rabbi. And let me tell you, I've never seen anything so pure and holy in my entire life. I started crying like a little baby. So I told the group I'll let them stay in my place if their rabbi blesses me with 3 things. First, I wanted the rabbi to bless me that my son not be drafted into the Tsar's army. Second, that I live a long and healthy life. And third, that my inn should be successful. The rabbi blessed me, and I let them in. And as I said, that was 20 years ago. And I've received all 3. My son, you see him. He's strong like a bull. But the second he walked into the draft office, they threw him out.
Get out of here!
And said he wasn't physically fit to serve in the army. And me, I'm over 80 years old and have never been sick since the time that rabbi blessed me. And my inn, thank God, has been very successful. Anyway, that rabbi, he got sicker until he passed away, and he was buried in the town of Haditch. But before he died, he requested something from me. He said if 2 Jews ever enter my inn and refuse to eat kosher food, I should scare them and threaten them even with death, but God forbid not to harm them. And since you two are the first Jews that have come in here and refused kosher food in the last 20 years, I guess he meant you too. So Moshe and Yankel, they were so affected by the story that they traveled to Haditch, where Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi was laid to rest while he was fleeing Napoleon's army in 1812. The Rebbe passed away on the 24th of Tevet, which is when I'm releasing this episode. Bezat Hashem. Of course, I've told the story many times. The Alter Rebbe was fleeing from Napoleon, who knew some type of black magic, and he didn't want Napoleon to draw any spiritual sustenance from him. Of course, the Alter Rebbe also opposed Napoleon's way, even though it gave more freedom to the Jews. The Alter Rebbe was concerned that Jews would not be able to resist the temptation to throw away Judaism and to start intermarrying, which of course, in retrospect, we know he was right. And even though it was somewhat inevitable, at least historically, the Alter Rebbe wanted to delay it as long as possible. Since then, the Alter Rebbe's grave in Haditch has become a sacred site for Chassidim who visit it till today. And after praying at Rebbe Shner Zalman's grave, the 2 businessmen traveled to Lubavitch to meet with the Rebbe's successor, his son, Rabbi Dovber, known as the Middler Rebbe. And they became Chassidim of the Middler Rebbe, and eventually the Tzemach Tzedek, who became the 3rd Lubavitcher Rebbe, and was known as a great leader in the bridge between the traditional and modern worlds, which had become the path of the Chabad Rebbes from that point on, to help us keep our focus and direction in the modern world that was created in the time of Napoleon. And the transformation of Moshe and Yankel was particularly meaningful during this time because it represented the victory of spiritual values over materialism at a time when young Jews were being drawn away from Judaism to the allure of modern European life. And their return to Judaism under the guidance of the Lubavitcher Rebbes is just one of many stories that are retold in Chassidic circles to teach us that even those who seem completely lost to the secular world can always find their way back to Yiddishkeit through Hashgacha Pratit, through divine providence. May we merit to see it in our own lives, my friends. Be'ezat Hashem. Hi, good Shabbos, good Shabbos, good Shabbos. Halalai, lai, 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 ama, nini, lai, 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 halalai, lai, lai, nini, lai, 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 nini, lai. The next story takes place in the late 1700s when the great tzaddik Rabbi Shmuel Shmelki Horovitz was the chief rabbi of Nikolsburg in Moravia. Now, Nikolsburg was known through the Jewish world as having been a center of Torah learning since medieval times. Many great rabbis came from there, and it was one of the most important Jewish communities in Central Europe. Now, Rabbi Shmelki wasn't just any rabbi. He was a direct disciple of the Maggid of Mezrich, of course was the successor to the Heilige Baal Shem Tov. And in those days, when the movement of Chassidus was still new and faced opposition, Rabbi Shmelki tried to be the bridge between traditional rabbinical scholarship and the new holy fire of Chassidus. Rabbi Shmelki himself was a great Talmudic scholar. However, despite his selfless nature and his flawless character, there was once a controversy in Nikolsburg that only a miracle could have helped. There was a wealthy Jew whose name was Reichman, and he was sued by a poor man in the Beit Din, where Rabbi Shmelki was the chief rabbi. And after hearing both sides of the argument, Rabbi Shmelki decided in the favor of the poor man. Well, Reichman was very angry, and his Yetzer Hara, his evil inclination, was so excited for all of the opportunities that presented themselves. Reichman was going to get his revenge against the rabbi, but he knew he had to be clever about it. He started quietly complaining, and because he was rich, people respected him and listened to him. At first it was only his family and friends, but slowly the circle widened. And after a few months, everybody had heard Reichman's claims. And what was the claim that was going to bring down Rabbi Shmelki? It was that he was secretly one of the Chassidim. He studies the mystical teachings of the Torah. Maybe tomorrow he's going to make up a new religion, and we can't have anything to do with this. And the truth is, the Jews in Nikolsburg were very upset. Reichman, being a wealthy Jew and a leader in the community, he called the whole community to a town meeting in the great synagogue. And the huge prayer hall was packed from door to door, window to window, and Reichman got up and said, Rabbi Shmelki is making up a new religion. He's not to be trusted, and we have to fire him. Some people supported the rabbi, some people supported Reichman, and eventually they decided to take a vote, and the majority decided to vote to oust the rabbi. Reichman had got his revenge. And suddenly, there was the voice of the elderly Shamash, the attendant who was the assistant to Rabbi Shmelki. And he said, I must say something. And people started quieting everyone down. Shh. Quiet, everyone. Shamash, he said, I have two things that I thought I would never say, but now it's clear that I have to tell everyone. It was about 10 years ago, after the rabbi had become our rabbi, I was knocking on windows before the sun came up to wake everyone up for the morning services, and I went to the rabbi's house, and I saw a light coming out of his window. And when I looked in, I saw he was studying Talmud with an ancient-looking Jew. I thought he must have been one of the 36 hidden tzaddikim. But when I saw him again the next morning, I decided I would ask the rabbi later in the day. And the rabbi said to me, What? You saw him? And when I said yes, the rabbi said, Well, if you saw him, I'll tell you who it was. It was Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet. But please don't tell anyone about it. A few days later, I saw him again. But this time it was very frightening. It was late at night, and the rabbi was standing at the door, escorting some people out of his house. And when I got to the door and I saw them, one of them I recognized as Eliyahu Navi, but the other was a king with royal garments, a crown, and even a royal scepter. And I was scared like I'd never been scared in my life. And the rabbi is escorting his guests a few steps out of the house. And then he returns to his house and goes back to learning Torah. I don't know how I found the chutzpah, but I knocked on the rabbi's door and told him what I just saw and demanded an explanation. The rabbi looked at me for a while. He said, Sit down. And then he said, a few weeks earlier, in a certain town in Poland, there was a terrible tragedy. There was a simple Jewish artisan who hated idols and idolatry. And this burned in his heart from the second commandment, you shall not have any other gods besides me. This mitzvah burned in his heart and he spoke of it all the time. And one night he ran into town and began smashing every statue he saw, including the ones in front of the church. There was a crowd that came out. They caught him and they beat him to death for destroying their idols. And it was with the greatest difficulty that the Jewish community was able to convince the non-Jews that he didn't represent the community, but he only acted on his own. And the elders of the community refused to provide for his widow from the widow's fund. They argued because he knew very well what would happen to him if he destroyed the idols in front of the church. And this was in a sense taking his own life. And so the widow would get charity like all of the other poor people, but not the higher sum from the widow's fund. And the widow went to the town's rabbis, and they brought her case in front of our rabbi, and Rabbi Shmelki was poring through the holy books, looking for a solution when the two people that I mentioned came to visit him. The first one, the rabbi said, was none other than Menashe, the idolatrous son of King Chizkiyahu. Since his death 2,000 years before, he had been reincarnated time and time again to atone for his sins. One of them, which was putting an idol in the Beit HaMikdash. But his soul found no rest until it became reincarnated into this Jewish artisan. And the reason that he hated idols and idolatry so much was because Menashe's tormented soul was seeking to do tshuva. And this is why he came to Rabbi Shmelki, to explain to him that the artisan wasn't crazy or suicidal. He was a Gilgul of Menashe, of King Menashe, who had come into this world to destroy idolatry and sanctify Hashem's name, the only thing that would finally purify King Menashe's soul. And Rabbi Shmelki told me he didn't know what he was going to decide regarding the widow's money, but he asked me to stay quiet. And now, my friends, the Shamash was telling the crowd, I have to tell you what a holy rabbi we have here, and I beg you to not be angry with him, and that hopefully he won't be angry at me for telling you this. And then the Shamash turned to Mr. Reichman, and he said, my sweetest friend, if he decided against you, it was for the benefit of everyone involved, including you, and if not you, then at least your soul. And after hearing this, the community dispersed and they canceled the ousting of the rabbi. And this story shows us something so deep about Hashgacha Pratit, divine providence. King Menashe, who the Talmud tells us was one of the biggest sinners in all of Jewish history, had done complete tshuva before he died. But his soul still needed to complete its tikkun, its fixing. And it took the holy wisdom of Rabbi Shmelki, who could see beyond the surface of things, to understand the true spiritual reality behind what seemed like a simple legal case. May we all merit, my sweetest friends, to see beyond the surface, like the great Rebbe, Rabbi Shmelki. I have one last story for you, and I have a feeling I might regret adding another story to be edited this week, but I read this on Shabbos, and it's not a long story, and it was a really good one, so I said I'm going to share it. Rabbi Moshe Grilak, who was one of the great rabbis who founded Mishpacha magazine and spoke to thousands, if not tens of thousands, of people over the years, passed away in 2023. He was once giving a seminar in Toronto for people wanting to reconnect with Judaism, and there was a senior doctor that was participating in the seminar. With a great deal of enthusiasm, he took in all of the knowledge that the rabbi was giving over and asked good questions, and had become convinced of the authenticity of Judaism with everything except for one thing: kosher slaughter, shechita. He himself was a vegan and a member of an animal welfare organization, and he couldn't understand why Jewish law opposes the stunning of an animal with an electric shock to prevent the pain before the ritual slaughter. And even though he understood that it might render the animal brain dead or cause some damage to the brain and then the animal wouldn't be kosher, the doctor said to the rabbi, if that's really the case, then slaughter should be altogether forbidden. No one should be allowed to eat meat. Now, he had been asking these questions through the first day of the seminar, so Rabbi Grilak knew what to expect in the next lecture, and he prepared for it. And it came down to a dialogue between him and the doctor, while the audience was listening as observers. And Rabbi Grilak said, the Torah commands that the knife being used to slaughter be completely smooth, without the slightest notch, not even a little nick. And this demonstrates that the Torah wants to prevent the suffering of animals, does it not? So the doctor said yes, and the rabbi continued and he said, the Torah says if there's any delay or interruption during the shechita, then the animal is not kosher. And that's another proof that we want to prevent the animal suffering. The doctor said yes, okay. And the rabbi said, and the Torah teaches us that when we're slaughtering, the trachea, esophagus, and the neck arteries have to be cut swiftly in one motion. And this causes the blood pressure in the brain to instantly drop to zero. The animal loses consciousness without feeling any pain, and this is further evidence of the Torah's great lengths to prevent suffering. And the doctor said, that's exactly what I disagree with. I'm a doctor, and I know the body. While the trachea, esophagus, and the neck artery are cut, the vertebral artery, which runs along the spine, continues to give blood to the brain, and therefore, in fact, the blood pressure does not drop because of the shechita, and the animal remains conscious and feels the pain and suffers. So the rabbi said, what would you say if I agree with you and you're correct as far as non-kosher animals go? Horses, donkeys, pigs, and camels. But for animals that are kosher, such as cows, goats, and sheep, the vertebral artery does not connect directly to the circle of Willis that supplies blood to the brain. Instead, it bends and connects to the neck artery and specifically prevents suffering during slaughtering. And when the neck artery is cut, the vertebral artery's blood also drains out, and it causes the animal to lose consciousness immediately without feeling any pain. The doctor said, that can't be! Why would the artery bend and connect differently in kosher animals than non-kosher animals? And the rabbi said, why? Because it's written about Hashem. His mercies are upon all of his works. V'rachamav al kol ma'asav. Hashem's compassion is even greater than the compassion of animal welfare activists. The doctor stood up. He was very upset. And he said, listen, Rabbi, I'm going to investigate this. And if you're right, I'll be attending your next seminar wearing a big kippah. It was a huge round of applause. It also melted the tension in the room. And Rabbi Grilak said a few months later, he was once back in Toronto giving a seminar, and it was wonderful to meet with the doctor, now wearing a big kippah and filled with a fervent faith in Judaism and in Hashem. Thank you so much for listening, as always, my sweetest friends. Thank you to all the supporters, the new and the old, all the listeners, the new and the old, all the people that send me comments and messages. Thank you so much for listening and sharing and retelling the stories. And I hope you have a beautiful Shabbos and a beautiful week. And until next week, my sweetest friends, take care of yourselves. Sei gesund.
Get out of here!